Hey, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our FDA webinar. This morning we're joined by Rebecca Kaya from Ashbury. Ashbury have been FDA service provider member for many years, labelling specialists. I'm sure many of you probably know Rebecca and know of Ashbury already, but she's going to be talking this morning about compliance considerations for exports. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca in a minute. If you do have any questions for her as you go along, please pop them in the chat box. We'll come back to them at the end, or there'll be some time for you to just take your camera off, come off mute at the end, and ask away as well. Yes, just to say that it is also being recorded, and we will send round the recording after the webinar as well. So over to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to today's session. We're going to be talking about key compliance considerations for exporting food and drink from the United Kingdom. We're going to touch on a few of those aspects around Brexit and the particularities of the Windsor Framework Agreement. I'm afraid we'll probably have to set aside 4 questions as we go through, but I'm very pleased to be with you today, and thank you very much. So let's get started. We do have about 45 minutes together today. I'm hoping the presentation run to about 30 minutes, so we are going to have plenty of time at the end. I do anticipate that this is principle-based information, and you're going to have some specific questions for me at the end, and I'll try to address those as we go through and at the end. Well, a little introduction to Ashbury Global. For those of you who don't know, we were founded in 2002 by James Post, and he's still running the organisation today. We're the trusted compliance partner for many of the UK's leading retailers, including Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Waitrose, Aldi, etc. They do keep us busy. And our mission is to protect those brands and consumers, and also brands by manufacturers as well, ensuring food information meets the regulatory requirements. We've got a fair few experts now, 150, covering 80 markets and 35 different languages. We've got operations, as you can see from the slide, in particular in the United States and in Australia, which are growing. So you well know, as I know some of you I recognise, GU, etc., do know that product labelling and compliance is essential for bringing products to new markets. For food business operators, you've got a especially complex regulatory landscape to navigate, and that can be a source of quite a lot of confusion. It's important to know that ensuring that you're compliant is going to keep your brand reputation high and reduce any risk for controls at borders being brought in and putting any consumers at risk as well. We exist to help you to navigate those complexities. So we do have a team of food technologists and regulatory professionals that span the globe to help you. Enough of that. Let's get cracking. So to successfully export to other markets, the first thing you need to do is really understand those complex regulatory mazes, but also understand the competent authorities you're going to be dealing with as well. And what I mean by that is those in those countries who are charged with policy and enforcement for regulations around food safety and food standards. Policies, science, public opinion, understanding of health consequences for foods, nutrition, disease controls, trade agreements, they all drive regulatory change. And only yesterday, I think it was, the United Kingdom finally signed a trade deal with India, as I understand it. So obviously those arrangements within the trade agreements and regulations sort of will follow and change the landscape for you. How do you navigate it though? It's not easy. I have to say there's no silver bullet to making sure that you stay ahead of compliance. Change is rapid, it's ever increasing. So what we do suggest is really building in internal skills and mechanisms to react quickly to the risk of non-compliance in food safety and food standards. So whether that's from external pressures, as we've sort of touched on and are illustrated here, or whether it's internal changes. So you may change a recipe, supplier arrangements, etc. This is just a map to sort of help you navigate what what would really be the key drivers to make you keep thinking, do I need to review what we've done, our formulation, our idea, what market we're going into? So horizon scanning is really the key to that. So it should really feed in all those aspects, feed into the horizon scanning that you should do, and it should really be a dynamic and ongoing process. From idea to expert says it all really. So once you understand that you've got to navigate that regulatory landscape and what that looks like for yourself, you can then really begin that journey. And it really should run alongside the actual concept of your food to right through to I'm going to target these particular markets or areas. There are some immediate considerations that you should have at the forefront of your mind when considering exporting. And the key is to really recognize that regulations don't, they're interpreted differently. There are very few occasions where you can rely on areas that are territories that are single markets all being the same. A great example is the EU. Whilst it's a single market in inverted commas and there are harmonized regulations across it, regulations that do state that whatever is legal in one member state would be legal in the other. It's just not universal. I'm sure you probably, those of you that are already exporting to the EU, because now it's an export exercise, not a distribution exercise, of course, will have encountered some of that already. So really identifying, again, top of the list, the competent authorities, understanding their enforcement, how they, whether your product is covered by one particular competent authority, it may be covered by another. You just haven't sort of appreciated that they have some involvement. But do you need to register, or notification requirements? Are they there? Do you need to register as your product onto that market? Packaging regulations as well. Got to think of those up front. The design, composition, recovery mechanisms are all now covered by a vast array of regulations. Of course, they're not harmonized, they're not the same. That makes it really difficult. Also, one thing that does frequently come up for us is the responsible party in the target market, really understanding that mechanism. Under food legislation, it's not a case, and we do permanently get this question, of having an address in a particular place. It may be that you need that person, your importer or the person you've contracted with to bring that into the market, to take responsibility for the product, but also they may need their information on the labeling. So all that food information is affected by that. Labeling requirements, of course, include language and translating into languages, but there are some particular issues around that. You can't just use a translation into a language. Don't use Google Translate. There are what we call in Ashbury a regulatory translation is required when you're thinking about translating into languages. Allowable claims, also a big part of selling your food, your USP. Health claims, nutrition claims, green claims, you've got to consider those all off from the very start, because those elements are all going to be critical to you understanding them before you start to engage with your distributors or importers. Certainly don't rely on looking at the market and thinking, well, it looks as if I'm mirroring what's on the market. It may be that those products aren't compliant, especially with the amount of products we see sold online. So we've said the fundamental consideration is the translation of the mandatory food information. So ingredients, instructions, everything's got to be in the official language of that market. But just a note of caution, sometimes you can get unintended meanings or misunderstandings because you haven't considered your product title or other advertising material. So your product title, your product name, also think about how that's going to be translated or how it's going to look, because I know poor old Picola, it's a top brand Ghanaian drink. However, there's an awful lot of fun being had at their expense. Right from the concept is where we want to sort of drill in that you've got to start making considerations about compliance. So during that conceptual phase, you've got to ensure that your selling point, your USP into the market is not going to sort of violate legal constraints. Very often, you may look at a market and think there's a gap there. There's a glaring gap for my particular product. Now, that may be that gap exists because there are regulatory challenges to getting a particular product into the market, whether it be something that contains a dairy product, etc. Do you buy chocolate? Do look that up. There's a number of pieces and posts about do buy chocolate and the ingredients it contains. It's a good example. So you need to check ingredients permissibility, their sourcing, what type of ingredients. Make sure that you are covering yourself in terms of the intellectual property for your product. In the market which you're aiming, is it protected? Are you going to infringe anybody else's intellectual property? And that does extend even to food names, which we'll touch on in a minute. Your cultural sensitivities, excuse me, always think about that as well. Is there absolutely no point into trying to go into a market with a product where the requirements are going to be, for example, because I know Mohammed's here, halal. Is it really de rigueur for any products going in to have to be halal certified, etc.? So consider those. Also, if we look at the graphic on the right hand side, it says border controls and it says food standards and food safety. And what I want to emphasize very much is that food safety we probably understand. It's contaminants, it's making sure the ingredients aren't going to harm anybody, etc. There is an intersection which we'll show in a minute. Food standards is anything you say about your food. So food standards is food information, and that does extend to advertising, online information, etc. And information you might pass on to a potential importer, etc. And the pace of change is incredibly fast. So what I wanted to do is make this today really as current as I could. And I did notice yesterday when I was looking that DEFRA announced, in terms of packaging, the extended producer responsibility regime, and just taking the UK as an example, for that regime for waste packaging for food is going to be radically revised. Even though those requirements were coming into force in October. So that indicates a pace of change, especially around packaging for foods in your different markets. There are international standards, however, we can't rely on them completely. So I wanted to, as a link there so you can go and have a look, because there's some basic concepts, some basic principles for food information and food safety, which you can find all about. The WTO SBS agreement, the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Within that, we've got the general standards for packaged foods in Codex Alimentarius. Whilst they underpin sort of the general food standards, food information sphere that you'll see globally, they're certainly not mirrored in national laws. It's not a wholesale bringing in of those requirements in any particular country. So they're not legally binding, but those basic principles, when you're thinking, I want to export, what am I going to need to be watching out for? The Codex standards are going to give you a good guide as to what's going to be required, and they're laid out here in this graphic. So one of the particular aspects of both food information and food standards, so it crosses those elements, is allergens and allergen labeling. So what I thought to do was to look at an example of ingredient regulation across the markets using in particular allergens, because they are the one thing, they are the most important thing. They render, if you get it wrong, the food unsafe. So therefore scrutiny around how you are conducting allergen information, how you're putting it on the packaging, etc., is high. It varies by country, sadly. We know that allergens recognised in one country are not going to be recognised as food allergens in another. And we know that at the moment we've got our 14 food allergens in the UK and EU. They mirror each other, which is lovely. But we have a possibility for diversification, of course, all the time. We've got to watch for that. But global lists, of course, vary. And one of the interesting things is that in the UK and EU, we do have reference to food allergens, but also those that cause intolerances. However, not the same across markets. So let's have a look at a few examples of where it differs, just to be aware of. And it's a good illustration here across the sort of world. One of the most important things to recognise when you're thinking of exporting is allergens, as I said. And the reason is that different populations are going to have different exposure to substances, and they're going to very much be led by their public health concerns as to what allergens they list, etc. So a good example where we might say nuts. Well, nuts are allergens. Well, not quite. We might be using the term pine nuts. Well, pine nuts aren't actually nuts botanically. So we've got a swathe of different allergens across the market there to look at. Some which you'll be familiar with, some which you won't necessarily. I know for certain that Lidl in Hong Kong is also concerned. So you might find your retailers or your importers are concerned about other allergens as well. I know for Lidl Hong Kong, they'd certainly want to know if there's any pork-related products in there, if there's any coconut in there, etc., because they are substances that they're interested in calling out to their consumers. Let's have a look at Australia, because Australia's introduced a new allergen labelling system called PEEL, or plain English allergen labelling, and it's kind of radically changed the way that they want allergen labelling to appear. And it's quite important because it's very prescribed, it's very prescriptive in how that formatting appears and how you identify what's a processing aid and how you put that into the labelling. So a good example here at 1, we've got allergenic ingredients, and note it's nothing to do with those that cause intolerances. Allergenic ingredients that they've decided in Australia must be declared using the prescribed names for those allergens, and in brackets following the ingredients. So a good example would be here for this label, where you've got yogurt as an ingredient. So a bit like we do in the UK and EU, we've got bracketed the allergen itself, which is milk. So that's how that must appear. An interesting they've gone a very different way, and that the interesting piece is processing aids. So allergens that are contained, they are processing aids. So we have to understand what a processing aid is. You've used a processing aid in your food. In the EU and UK, you would simply declare that where that's an allergen in the list of ingredients. However, for Australia, that's pulled out and must be the allergen itself is indicated as a processing aid in the labelling. Another important piece is we've got a summary statement in Australia. It looks suspiciously like what we call a precautionary allergen labelling statement, or a PAL statement, and we know that the regime around that and there's a lot of discussion around that in the UK at the moment. But this isn't a precautionary allergen labelling. This is part of the mandatory allergen information you've got to provide in the prescribed way for Australia. So you can see that it can appear either top, bottom, left or right, that contains piece. So it's not a precautionary allergen labelling statement where you've got the possibility of cross-contamination that you can't eliminate, so therefore you put it onto the food to make sure it's safe. This is definitely a sort of repetition of those allergens in a box to make it absolutely clear or plain. So those little boxes, they may not be interrupted by any other food information or anything else. They've got to be adjacent to the ingredients list. So a good example. But when we want to think about, well, we've got the same language for the US and Australia. Can we have one SKU going that way? No. Can we use one set of labelling? No. And the reason is the US labelling looks quite different. They allow far more flexibility in the way they ask you to present that allergen information. They don't mandate a contained statement, a bit like we do in UK and EU, but it does include the optional contained statement where you can't eliminate that cross-contamination. Interestingly, they recognise, of course, a different set of common allergens, as we've seen in the list before. and they do not refer at all to ingredients causing intolerances in the US. It's a good example of just how difficult it is to correctly label across sort of multiple jurisdictions. So you've got your ingredients. You'd think, well, yogurt is yogurt, isn't it? Yogurt will be recognized as a dairy derived fermented product. However, even the name yogurt and other names can present problems. So you, alongside a name like yogurt, you've got compositional standards or rules to consider. You may be more familiar, and I know we've got some confectionery guys with us with the chocolate. What is deemed chocolate? There are some parameters around what you can call chocolate. Well, even in a territory, you've got that single market, you've got the EU. What exactly is considered a yogurt might slightly vary from member state to member state. So those compositional standards and rules, got to think about those as well. Alongside those legally protected food names, there's a new piece of EU legislation came out last year. It's caused an awful lot of problems where people want to use protected food names like Parmigiano Reggiano, for example, those protected ingredients under the legislation in their own products. And that's presented a lot of challenges because you now have to wait 3 months. You have to notify that you wish to use the ingredient in your product and wait 3 months to see if they respond and say yes or no. So a very complicated picture. So names do cause problems. Another example I found yesterday was a US recall of a product. It was a non-dairy creamer. I thought this was a really good example. We're talking about dairy products here, and the recall was due to the fact that the allergens hadn't been called out. But you think, well, this is a non-dairy creamer. That's its stated product title. However, it did contain whey and it did contain casein. So there was, despite the fact they do allow the term non-dairy creamer for these products, it actually contain dairy proteins in there. So a good watch out. A little summary for you in terms of ingredients. We don't have time to explore all these today, but what I did want to do was make sure you had some sort of framework to look at what those ingredient types, where they're going to cause problems, what you've got to consider: additives, vitamins, what is a processing aid, because that'll affect the labeling, what you don't have to declare, fortification substances. They cause an awful lot of issues. So where you're adding vitamins and minerals, how you present that information, what types of those you use, all present complexities when thinking about exporting. I don't think we've got anyone here today that's interested in food supplements, but if you ever want to perhaps give yourself some sleepless nights, go into food supplement exporting. Very, very complex indeed. Claims and public health warnings. Making claims on food is probably one of the riskiest areas for non-compliance, but it's one we want to do. So how do we navigate that? Certainly governments are tightening the rules around this. General health claims, nutrient-specific claims, green or environmental claims, functional food benefits you want to shout out, thinking CBD or adaptogens as a way of describing a food. They're all much more heavily controlled than they were. And governments are also introducing food labelling requirements for, as you probably know, high fat, salt and sugar foods that affect front of pack labelling. You may have warnings, etc. You may have taxes applied to your foods as well. Heavily scrutinised is what they are. So export markets are looking at this as well, and thinking back to our little graphic that said food standards and food safety at border controls, these claims, if they're not made properly or they're made outside the requirements for that market, they will stop your food at the border if that is incorrect. So just want to emphasize that. So some good examples here. South Africa has recently moved to control claims in some draft regulations they published last year. I'm not quite sure whether they are implementing them yet. And they're quite, this is quite advanced really. They're really clamping down on things we would think as very general claims like nutritious, etc., but a real watch out that they are attempting to control the use of these. Another thing that happened over the past week was that the EU Court of Justice have decided that those botanical ingredients that are associated with physiological and psychological benefits, like we're still thinking about whether it includes physiological benefits as well. I think the court still is. They've decided that these are now restricted based on a German case that was brought to the higher courts. So at the moment, even though you may have some mild claims around calming, etc., I'd be very, very cautious about that. And finally, we've got the US, which is established with a final rule from the FDA. It's established some controls around the term healthy and all the derived sort of words, healthier, healthiest, etc. So be wary of those. So as health concerns are raised around foods like ultra processed foods, all those catchphrases we see and some of the pseudoscience we see go with it as well. Governments have reacted and they are adopting front of pack warnings for foods which we know to be less healthy, if you like. So those high fat in salt, sugar and fat, salt and sugar are HFSS foods as we know them in the UK. But the systems for doing this vary widely. We've got Nutri-Score, which is still something that France uses. They've adopted it as fairly universal. For example, Carrefour, the big retailer, of course, in France, has decided that every supplier, they want Nutri-Score, though it's not mandated to be on the front of pack. So that involves obviously calculating the nutrition score of your product against those parameters. Then we've got Canada, which is going to clamp down in 2026 and introduce mandatory nutrition front of pack warnings for high fat, salt and sugar foods. They're going to have big black marks across the front should your products fall into that. And then we've got the Latin American suite of warnings, illustrated there by Colombia's warning label for products which, again, high fat, salt and sugar, if they fall into those parameters, are going to have to carry those big, they look like stop signs, don't they? Big black stop signs in on the front of pack. So again, it's really looking to those policies and those trade agreements to see if you're going to be affected and understanding the composition of your own food against those parameters. A little summary of what we really see as regular non-compliances for food crossing borders anywhere. Allergens and ingredients is something we've delved into a little bit today. Traceability information, so that whole piece about putting the importer's name on the food, etc., in your different market. What does that look like? Very often we come a cropper with that one. Country of origin labelling. I'm not even going to go there at the moment, but obviously for some particular foods, there will be country of origin labelling requirements. So a good example, I guess, it's just come to my mind is for Thailand and coconuts. So for them, the indication that coconuts, if they're used as an ingredient, say coconut milk, there's a requirement for Thai produced foods to have that labelled on them. So it's looking and understanding that country of origin is going to be an aspect you'll have to consider. Formatting of nutrition tables, good example, is using sodium instead of salt. They are interchangeable perhaps, but they are prescribed. Our nutrition tables prescribe that we say salt. In the US, it's prescribed that you will say sodium. Packaging non-compliances, again, do think about deposit return schemes, DRS schemes. Ireland, mandatory scheme now. So the return scheme, we've come across a few issues of that not being sort of understand that that's got to go on products that are in scope of that deposit return scheme. Think about your ingredients. They're going to be medicinally regarded as medicinal in some jurisdictions. They may be novel ingredients in some and not in others. Think of marketing registration requirements. Food supplements in Ireland, you would have to register those products, and going into China, etc., there are some registration requirements as well. Remember, each one of these can stop your product at the border. We don't want that to happen. So a little summary and some final takeaways for you to consider. Fairly simple. Know your market. Are there any shared food standards and labeling standards? Can you harmonize your SKUs? Can you go into several markets at once? How does that affect the food information? The competent authorities said it too much. Understanding your packaging regulations and environmental regulations. So California, PFAS, etc. Resolution 65, I think it's called. All those aspects. Don't assume what's on the shelf already is compliant, though. Don't look at your market and assume that you to mirror what's already there is necessarily reflective of being a compliant product. Do get expert help in your market. The good news is, though, once you've navigated it successfully once, it'll be a whole lot easier. You'll already have that information. And then what you need to do is simply to look out for those changes. It's utterly surmountable, although it may feel like an absolute nightmare to start with. I know a lot of you are already on that journey, so you'll have some idea of just what it looks like. Wouldn't want to put anyone off it. It can be incredibly rewarding, and there are organisations able to help you. Getting together with other members of an organisation like FDEA is absolutely brilliant for sharing that knowledge and experience is going to help you. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've found something very useful. If you've got any questions or need some tailored guidance, do reach out, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time to go through some questions you might have now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's really interesting. Yeah, always useful. And it's always something that comes up, particularly in our WhatsApp group, about, different labelling and compliance issues that people have. So if anybody does have a question for Rebecca while she's on, please do take yourself off mute and ask away.
I shall end the slideshow, Mel, so I can see
Okay,
people's
yeah.
faces. That'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah, please don't be shy. She's, if you're having any issues or got any new export markets that you're looking at, please do take this opportunity to ask some questions.
You're shy today.
I think we are, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for me, I think one question sort of with all the different things that need to go on, all the different labels, all around the world, stickers and things for samples, that's fine, is it? Or
Samples.
yeah,
So trade samples have been a never-ending pain.
yeah, and
Now,
still trade
yeah,
shows it always comes up.
absolutely. So you would not expect, because any sort of regulation around food information really is going to be lessened. You know for a start that it'll be lessened because you're not dealing with a final consumer, which is the person that's actually going to cook, eat, etc. that food. So for trade samples, now officially trade samples under, and I give you the example of EU regulations, the sanitary control regulations, they do not actually require you to give that much information. You should have enough to keep it safe, etc. Obviously, you've got some issues around wanting to perhaps not give away the entire recipe when you're looking at trade samples. So I would just say it depends on where you're going. There's no way that full labeling would be required. However, you might want to think, do people want to see that you've already got that right? Your sort of whole piece of food information is correct for that market. It's going to be always a problem at the border if you've got anything that's a trade sample, because I don't think there's the level of knowledge about how they should be treated. They really don't need. I've looked at this regulation so many times. You don't really need a full export health certificate, for example, if it's product covered by that requirement. So, or a private attestation if you're going into the EU. It should be treated as not going onto the market, but I know that it does still present a lot of difficulties. So what I'd say is probably you don't need to put that full information on packaging and have developed full packaging and full labeling for your product. That information, as it will appear, and it's in its sort of wholeness, in its completeness, should be available on documentation for the person that's going to receive that sample.
Okay, yeah. To see a question in the chat box. One question from Connor. Are there any primary resources, general approaches that you would recommend to get a good start on regulatory research and monitoring in different markets and in regulatory environments? I think, yeah, it's where do people to go to find out this information? And I think that's always a tricky one.
It really is, and I guess that's why I sort of thought, oh, I'm repeating competent authorities too much here. But actually, once you've done that piece and you say, right, I've got, I'm just going to take an example. I've got a food supplement, and it's going to go into this particular market. I know in this particular market, it's not governed by this competent authority because actually they've decided that, a bit like us, the Department of Health and Social Care have an involvement, their version of it. So who may be covering medicines as well, are concerned with food supplements, which is my product. So when you've done that identification of that competent authority, that's the best way to go then when you've done that, to look at what they cover. What do they enforce? What regulations are they concerned with? Now, that's a great way to start investigating what those requirements are. It's a good mechanism because whilst AI's kind of getting there, it's not bad. We have ourselves at Ashbury not found the like golden goose in terms of being able to horizon scan in and drill down to that granularity you'd need to understand all those things. You've got to be compliant, all those compliant aspects. I think
And
that's
companies like Ashbury can help with compliance. Yeah, compliance labels and things. You mentioned the Codex standards as well. That's a good sort of general overview, but not to be sort of used as the Bible.
Yes, not it's a good template, as illustrated in the slides as well. Hopefully they will help you too. It's a good template for understanding where you're going to come across requirements. It's, of course, it's general food labeling standards where you've got, I was thinking about the most complex scenario I can think of is probably, non-alcoholic wine. That's a great one. You're going to have to look more deeply. So you look for, within Codex, you'll find limited sort of granular information about what those requirements are. If you've got a very specialized product, which is covered by one of those special names and special compositional standards, and it's understanding as well, products like wine are going to be in the trade agreements is actually a great place to look as well. Look in the annexes, see what's covered, because the legislation will be listed as well.
Yeah,
that's a good thought. A product like wine is going to be, because it's an excise good, they get taxes, extra taxes. I don't know a country that doesn't sort of get extra taxes from alcohol products. They're going to be subject to sort of a lot of scrutiny. So if you're going to go down the line, you've got a very specialized product like that, excuse me, then sounds like I've drunk some. Then it's going to be difficult to drill down into that without understanding what competent authority in your market covers that, and then going down the route, what do those very particular regulations and requirements look like? Because they will be subject to scrutiny, being the type of products they are.
Okay. Any further questions?
Any more, just pop them into the chat. I am party to the chat as well. The exporters chat there, so I will see any questions. If you do think of something, you want to pop it in.
The WhatsApp group has been really helpful for members, and I think just to get that sort of peer-to-peer advice has been really valuable. So if you are unsure about some compliance issues, then do just ask away. Somebody will hopefully have the answer. The benefit of a community like that is really, really good. So so like we said, if you do have any questions that you can think of afterwards for Rebecca, then please do get in touch. I will send around the recording and Rebecca's slides to everybody afterwards, probably be tomorrow that I send them around. So if you do have any questions, please do get in touch with Ashbury, Rebecca. And thank you very much for your time this morning.
Pleasure, always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.